The grand halls of the Xyrillian palace shimmered with iridescent light, cast from crystalline panels that shifted colors with the movement of the suns above. Gold and silver banners lined the corridors, bearing the emblem of the empire, an intricate spiral of stars encircling a sword that had never failed to conquer. In the midst of this opulence walked Princess Lys, the youngest heir of the Xyrillian dynasty, her flowing gown of starlight blue tracing the polished floors, her crown glinting with the brilliance of captured nebulae. She moved with a haughty grace, aware of the throngs of courtiers who bowed as she passed, their whispers trailing behind her like the tail of a comet. She was the empire's pride, expected to marry not for love but for politics, to cement alliances that spanned star systems and generations. Her intended husband, Lord Vaynor, awaited in the central chamber, a man whose lineage alone made him desirable to her advisors. Tall, precise, and adorned in armor that shimmered with artificial gravitas, he was everything her people believed a Xyrillian ruler should be: calculating, unflinching, utterly predictable. Lysera had been taught to admire his efficiency, to appreciate the security his union would bring to the empire, but she had never learned to love. She had been trained to wield influence, navigate courts, and charm allies, yet she had no experience with the unpredictable, chaotic nature of genuine emotion, and it was precisely this unpredictability that she found herself mocking every time. She glimpsed the human who had arrived unexpectedly in the palace weeks ago. He was a singular anomaly, standing out among the polished and precise beings of the Xyrillian court. A human, barely considered a threat or ally, had been sent as part of a minor diplomatic mission, a gesture to acknowledge the presence of humanity in interstellar politics. To the courtiers, he was a curiosity, a fragile and clumsy creature who had stumbled into a world far beyond his comprehension. Lysera had taken delight in his missteps, his misunderstandings of protocol, and his tendency to treat everything with blunt practicality rather than the subtlety expected in courtly matters. She had laughed at him openly in the gardens, watched him trip over ceremonial carpets, and roll his eyes at ornate displays of pageantry. Yet beneath the amusement, a subtle unease had begun to creep into her thoughts. The human, named Corin, had an unassuming air, wiry but firm, his movements unrefined yet efficient, as though every action he took had a purpose he did not need to explain. Where Xyrillians moved like precise machines, he moved like a river flowing, adaptable, unpredictable. He asked questions others did not, noticed details the court overlooked, and acted with a confidence that was not born of arrogance but of competence and awareness. Lysera found herself begrudgingly intrigued, even as she continued to mock him in front of her advisors. He had saved the palace kitchens from a catastrophic fire, a minor but undeniable failure of the Xyrillian protocols, and no one had thanked him properly, save for the servants he had quietly reassured. Yet he did not seek recognition, did not boast, he simply acted, and it unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. The day of the formal betrothal arrived, the chamber filled with dignitaries from dozens of star systems, their gowns shimmering with precious metals, their voices a low hum of diplomatic courtesy. Lysera stepped forward, crown gleaming eyes on Lord Vaynor, who stood rigid and expressionless. Corin was present, awkwardly positioned at the edge of the hall, observing, yet standing taller than his stature should have allowed, as if he carried with him an invisible weight of purpose. As the ceremony commenced, Lysera's thoughts wandered to him, a fleeting sense of admiration brushing against her irritation. Why did his presence unsettle her so? She was supposed to marry for duty, not for curiosity or sentiment, and yet she found her gaze returning to him again and again. Midway through the ceremony, an alarm echoed through the palace, a sound that rippled through every floor and corridor. Energy fields flickered, and the guards stiffened, alerting the court to an unexpected intrusion. Lysera's advisors whispered in panic. Some even looked at Corin with thinly veiled suspicion, for humans were not known for combat, let alone intervention in an empire's affairs. But Corin moved immediately, not hesitating, not faltering. With a speed that defied expectation, he assessed the threat, calculated a response, and began directing the palace's defenses. His hands moved across control panels with precision, rerouting energy fields, stabilizing security grids, and moving civilians to safety, all in a sequence that made even the seasoned Xyrillian commanders step back in awe. Lysera watched him, heart pounding, caught between disbelief and admiration. She had always assumed humans were fragile, incapable of meaningful action in the high-stakes affairs of interstellar politics and warfare. And yet here he was, turning chaos into order, saving lives with calm efficiency where trained Xyrillians hesitated. He did not yell, he did not panic, and he did not seek to impress anyone. He simply did what needed to be done. Lysera felt a strange pang of guilt. She had mocked him for being human, for being, in her eyes, inferior. And yet he had become the only force capable of protecting her court in a moment of crisis. The threat revealed itself as a fleet of raiders, a mercenary group known for striking quickly and without mercy. They had slipped past orbital defenses and now threatened the palace itself. Corrin quickly assessed the situation, devising a plan that relied on both the palace's defenses and his own ingenuity. Lysera observed as he coordinated teams of soldiers, technicians, and even civilians, directing them with clarity and purpose that surpassed any Xyrillian general. His commands were concise but precise, every action accounted for, every contingency planned. Lysera felt a mix of awe and unease. She had believed she understood humans, yet Corrin was proving her assumptions catastrophically wrong. As the first wave of raiders struck, Corrin moved into the fray with a confidence that belied his size. His sword, a simple human weapon, became an extension of his will, cutting through mechanized attackers with agility and precision that left Xyrillian guards scrambling to keep up. Where the Empire's soldiers relied on overwhelming technology, he relied on awareness, speed, and adaptability. Lysera watched as he saved civilians from collapsing structures, disabled enemy weapons, and even anticipated strikes that would have killed trained soldiers. Her heart raced, a strange combination of fear and exhilaration. He was human, yes, but fragile. Hardly when the battle moved to the palace's central terrace, where the raiders attempted to breach the royal vaults, Corrin's ingenuity became evident. He rigged defensive mechanisms, manipulated energy shields, and lured the enemy into traps with a mix of tactical brilliance and intuitive understanding. Lysera found herself following him, heart pounding, not because she feared for herself, but because every moment he acted she realized that her empire had almost collapsed without his intervention. She had mocked him for being a human, yet here he was, saving everything she held dear, orchestrating the defense with a calm authority that even her political betrothed lacked. Vaynor attempted to assert command, but Corrin anticipated every move, countering with quiet authority and precision. Soldiers who had been trained to obey Xyrillian nobility instead followed Corrin's lead instinctively, responding to competence rather than rank. Lysera's eyes followed every movement, every calculation he made, and she realized that for the first time in her life, she had witnessed a mortal elevate themselves above royalty, above protocol, and above expectation through sheer skill, intelligence, and courage. Her amusement at his human frailty had transformed into admiration, tinged with something more dangerous, fascination. By the time the last of the raiders were neutralized, the palace lay battered but intact, thanks almost entirely to Corrin's leadership. Guards, soldiers, and civilians alike looked to him with newfound respect, whispering in awe about the human who had saved the Empire in a single, decisive effort. Lysera's heart swelled with a complicated mix of relief, respect, and unacknowledged admiration. She had mocked him for being human, for being unpredictable and fragile, but in truth, he had proven that the human qualities she had scorned were precisely what made him invaluable. As the sun set over the palace, casting long shadows across the marble floors, Lysera approached Corrin quietly. He had cleaned his weapon, adjusted his coat, and now stood, calm and composed, surveying the palace with a quiet awareness that left even the most seasoned courtiers in awe. "You saved us all," she said softly, words almost unnecessary but heavy with meaning. Corrin merely nodded, eyes steady, a quiet confidence emanating from him that seemed to fill the vast hall. There was no boast, no prideful display, only the calm satisfaction of someone who had done what needed to be done. For Lysera, everything had shifted. The human she had mocked, the creature she had considered fragile and inconsequential, had proven that strength was not measured by lineage, size, or titles, but by intelligence, courage, and the willingness to act when the moment demanded it. She glanced at her politically arranged groom, Lord Vaynor, whose rigid composure now seemed hollow and inadequate compared to Corrin's decisive actions. For the first time, she questioned the dictates of duty and tradition. Perhaps, she thought, The galaxy's survival and the Empire's future required more than adherence to protocol. It required courage, ingenuity, and a willingness to defy expectations, qualities she had just witnessed in a human. And in that quiet moment, Lysera began to understand that the human she had mocked was not merely a curiosity or an anomaly. He was a force, a protector, and a reminder that even the smallest, most underestimated beings could shape destinies, save empires, and defy the assumptions of entire civilizations. She did not yet know how far her admiration would go, or what consequences it would bring, but she could not deny the truth. Corran, the human, had saved everything, and in doing so, he had changed her understanding of the universe and, perhaps even of herself. The aftermath of the raid left the palace abuzz with whispers and speculation. Courtiers and soldiers alike spoke of Corran in hushed tones, recounting his decisive actions with a mix of awe and disbelief. No human had ever been present in the Xyrillian court, much less performed feats of such effectiveness, and yet there he stood, unassuming and calm, as if the entire affair had been routine. Princess Lysera could not escape the pull of her thoughts. Every time she recalled the moments of terror and precision, she felt a strange mixture of admiration, gratitude, and a growing, dangerous curiosity. The Empire had survived, yes, but it had survived because of him, a mortal whom she had once thought inconsequential. Her political betrothal now felt hollow, a ceremony devoid of the qualities she had come to value in Corran: courage, adaptability, and the uncanny ability to command respect without relying on status or authority. In the days that followed, the court struggled to regain equilibrium. The palace's defenses were reinforced, and ambassadors from neighboring systems arrived to assess the Empire's security. Yet the narrative had shifted irreversibly. The Empire had been saved, not by lineage, not by technology, but by a human. Corran moved quietly through the palace, assisting where he could, offering guidance to engineers and strategists, and subtly reshaping protocols to prevent future disasters. He did not seek recognition, yet every action he took left an impression. Soldiers who had doubted his abilities now whispered of him with reverence, noting his uncanny intuition and quick, decisive thinking. Even the most seasoned generals, once confident in their superiority, found themselves observing him closely, attempting to understand how a human could consistently anticipate outcomes and act with unerring precision. Lysera observed from the balcony of her private chambers, eyes tracing his movements below. She had been trained to judge mortals as weak and predictable, but he was neither. He moved through the palace like a storm contained in human form, subtle yet unstoppable, precise yet adaptable. Where Xyrillians relied on calculation, discipline, and technology, Corran relied on observation, intuition, and an audacity that defied expectation. Each interaction with him left her unsettled, questioning the assumptions she had long held about strength, intelligence, and the essence of leadership. Even Lord Vaynor, her politically arranged groom, seemed diminished in comparison. His rigid adherence to protocol and hierarchy rendered inadequate beside Corran's effortless competence. An urgent council was called, attended by the highest-ranking members of the Empire, to address the threat of a second wave of mercenary attacks. Lysera was present, crown gleaming, heart uneasy, and Corran was summoned to provide counsel. As the discussions commenced, it became clear that the Empire's standard strategies were insufficient. Calculations were based on probability, models, and assumptions that failed to account for the human factor. Corran spoke quietly, suggesting tactical adjustments, alternative formations, and contingency plans that combined technology with creative improvisation. The generals bristled at first, unused to a mortal challenging their authority, but slowly, grudgingly, they recognized the value of his insight. When the raiders struck again, this time with heavier forces and more advanced war machines, Corran's strategies proved decisive. He moved among the defenders, directing squads to exploit weaknesses he had observed, adapting in real time to the mercenaries' tactics. Buildings became defensive hubs, energy fields were optimized, and civilians were evacuated with remarkable efficiency. Every movement was calculated yet flexible, a demonstration of human adaptability that defied the rigid, formulaic strategies of the Xyrillian military. Lysera watched from above, heart pounding, as he turned the tide once again. Where she had once laughed at his human frailty, she now marveled at his ingenuity, understanding that this mortal possessed qualities the Empire had long overlooked and undervalued. Corrin's effectiveness did not go unnoticed. Ambassadors from allied systems, observing the defense from a distance, began requesting private meetings, seeking his guidance on tactics, infrastructure, and governance. Lycera realized that he was quietly reshaping the Empire's perception of humanity itself. Once considered fragile, insignificant, and unpredictable in the worst sense, humans were now seen as resourceful, courageous, and capable of extraordinary leadership. His influence spread subtly, like a ripple through the water, changing opinions, inspiring loyalty, and demonstrating that strength could manifest in forms the Empire had never anticipated. Amidst this growing respect, Lycera's feelings became increasingly complicated. She had been taught to value duty, lineage, and the strategic advantages of political marriage, yet she could not ignore the pull of admiration and, perhaps, something deeper for the human who had repeatedly saved her empire. She observed how he moved among the palace staff, soldiers, and civilians, with quiet authority, never demanding recognition, yet commanding loyalty through competence and presence alone. His actions challenged everything she had believed about leadership, power, and what it meant to be truly strong. One evening, as the sun set and painted the palace in hues of gold and violet, Lycera approached Corrin privately. He was inspecting the palace's energy conduits, ensuring that damage from previous attacks was repaired efficiently. She hesitated, aware of the protocol that dictated her interactions with humans, yet compelled by a mixture of curiosity and respect. "You've done more than anyone expected," she said softly, her voice betraying a hint of vulnerability. Corrin looked up, expression calm, and offered a simple nod. "I did what needed to be done," he replied. There was no arrogance, no attempt to impress, only the quiet confidence of someone who acted because it was necessary, not for glory. Their conversations continued over the following weeks, a mix of strategy, diplomacy, and shared observations. Lycera found herself drawn to him, not because of political calculation, but because he challenged her understanding of what it meant to be capable, courageous, and human. He questioned assumptions, offered solutions where others saw only limitations, and faced danger with a clarity and calm that made even the most confident Xyrillians uneasy. She began to realize that her empire, her people, and perhaps even herself, had benefited in ways she could not have predicted simply because of the presence of a human who refused to be underestimated. Tensions in the empire remained high. Other systems, emboldened by the news of the mercenary attacks, began testing the empire's strength, probing defenses, and attempting to exploit perceived vulnerabilities. Corrin was called upon repeatedly, assessing threats, offering strategic counsel, and, when necessary, leading small defensive operations himself. Lycera accompanied him on these assessments, observing his methods and noting the subtle ways he balanced risk and initiative. His actions consistently revealed that human ingenuity was not bound by the same rules that constrained Xyrillia. Where her people relied on rigid procedure, he relied on adaptability, intuition, and the relentless pursuit of effective solutions. As Corrin's reputation grew, whispers circulated in the court about the potential for humans to play a more central role in the governance and defense of the empire. Lycera found herself caught between duty and admiration, protocol and instinct. She had been trained to marry for alliance, yet she increasingly recognized that the human before her embodied qualities her politically arranged groom could never replicate: courage, adaptability, insight, and an ability to act decisively when all else faltered. Her heart and mind wrestled with an emerging truth. She could no longer dismiss him as fragile, irrelevant, or merely amusing. He had become essential not just to the empire, but to her understanding of strength itself. The next challenge arrived, without warning. Reports indicated that a coalition of neighboring star systems, believing the empire weakened by recent attacks, was preparing to launch coordinated strikes against multiple frontier worlds simultaneously. The Xyrillian Council was paralyzed by indecision, weighing political consequences against military capabilities, yet Corrin immediately began crafting a comprehensive response. He analyzed logistics, troop movements, energy reserves, and communication channels, devising a plan that balanced defense and deterrence while minimizing loss of life. His strategy was elegant, precise, and adaptive, qualities the Xyrillian generals had never seen demonstrated with such consistency. Lycera observed as he coordinated the deployment of forces across the frontier. Soldiers who had once doubted him followed orders without hesitation. Engineers implemented his structural modifications, and planetary governors reported directly to him for guidance. Every movement, every instruction was imbued with a quiet authority that transcended rank and title. Lysera's admiration deepened, tempered by the knowledge that her empire's survival increasingly relied on a being she had once mocked. She realized, with an uncomfortable clarity, that human ingenuity, courage, and adaptability were forces the Empire could neither ignore nor underestimate. When the coalition finally struck, Corrin was ready. He moved through the battlefields like a conductor directing a symphony, anticipating enemy maneuvers, exploiting vulnerabilities, and maintaining cohesion among disparate forces. Energy cannons, starships, and planetary defenses operated in perfect synchrony under his guidance, overwhelming the coalition before they could achieve any meaningful foothold. Lysera, observing from a secure vantage point, could hardly comprehend the scale of his impact. Where Xyrillians had relied on brute strength and procedural adherence, Corrin had relied on adaptability, observation, and decisive action qualities that allowed one human to orchestrate the defense of entire worlds. By the time the coalition forces retreated, the frontier systems were secure. Civilians and soldiers alike praised the human who had saved countless lives and preserved the Empire's dominion. Lysera's political betrothal seemed increasingly irrelevant in the shadow of Corrin's achievements. Her mind wrestled with conflicting thoughts. Duty demanded adherence to tradition, yet her admiration, respect, and perhaps something more, demanded recognition of his unique qualities. She had begun to understand that the Empire's future, and perhaps her own understanding of leadership and strength, could not be separated from the presence and actions of this human, who had proven that even the most underestimated species could alter the course of events on a galactic scale. And so, as the suns set once more over the palace, Lysera stood quietly in the halls, contemplating the human who had saved everything. She had once mocked him for being fragile, unpredictable, and insignificant, yet he had proven otherwise at every turn. He had turned chaos into order, uncertainty into decisive action, and doubt into unwavering confidence. In a universe that had dismissed humanity as weak, Corrin had shown that adaptability, intelligence, and courage could outmatch lineage, technology, and protocol. The princess realized, with a mixture of awe, gratitude, and trepidation, that the human she had mocked had not only saved her empire, he had redefined what it meant to be strong, and what it meant to lead. The galaxy had begun to take notice. Word of the human who had saved the Xyrillian Empire spread like wildfire, carried by traders, diplomats, and the whispers of surviving mercenaries. Across the frontier systems, leaders debated what it meant that a single human could orchestrate defenses, anticipate attacks, and turn chaos into victory with such efficiency. Lysera found herself accompanying Corrin on assessments of vulnerable planets, watching him move seamlessly between councils, soldiers, and engineers, directing efforts with calm authority. Each step he took seemed measured and instinctive, his presence alone reshaping perceptions of humanity. Where once humans were dismissed as fragile, inefficient, or unpredictable, they were now being regarded as catalysts for survival, capable of feats that no Xyrillian mind had anticipated. Corrin did not seek glory, nor did he indulge in the admiration that followed him. He acted with a simplicity and clarity that confounded the Empire's nobility. He analyzed, adapted, and executed with precision, as if the complexities of interstellar politics and warfare were puzzles to be solved rather than games of prestige. Lysera, walking beside him through corridors of council chambers and makeshift command centers, could not help but be captivated by the effortless authority he exuded. His mind operated differently from anyone she had known. Where her people relied on long-standing procedures and elaborate strategies, he trusted observation, intuition, and rapid adaptation. It was not raw power that made him extraordinary. It was the combination of insight, courage, and a willingness to act when others hesitated. The first sign of a larger threat came in the form of intelligence, reports detailing a coalition of rogue systems, long held in check by the Empire's diplomacy, now forming under the leadership of an enigmatic warlord. These systems had observed the failures of the Empire during the mercenary raids and interpreted Corrin's interventions as a signal of Xyrillian vulnerability. Fleet movements, troop concentrations, and supply lines were being adjusted, and spies reported a plan to strike not merely at frontier worlds, but at the very core of the Xyrillian Empire itself. Lysera's advisors grew frantic, calculating probabilities, proposing convoluted defensive formations, and debating over Corrin listened quietly, eyes sweeping over maps, holographic projections, and reports, absorbing details that others dismissed as irrelevant. By the time the coalition fleet appeared on sensors, Corrin had already devised a plan. He did not rely on overwhelming firepower. He relied on maneuver, anticipation, and exploiting weaknesses in both their formation and their leadership. Lysera watched as he coordinated the mobilization of planetary defenses, with small, nimble strike teams, all working in perfect synchronization. Every instruction he gave, every adjustment he made, was executed with a clarity that left the Xyrillian generals scrambling to keep up. Where others relied on static assumptions, he thrived in fluidity, moving like a river through the chaos of war, shaping outcomes in real time. When the first battle erupted in the space above Xyrillian territory, Corrin's strategy became immediately evident. Fleets moved in unexpected formations, striking where enemy commanders expected weakness, and avoiding where they anticipated strength. Energy beams were redirected using existing planetary infrastructure, forcing the coalition into traps that minimized casualties and maximized disruption. Lysera, observing from the palace's strategic command center, could hardly comprehend the scale of his foresight. The human who had once stumbled awkwardly through courtly halls was now orchestrating the defense of multiple planets with an elegance and efficiency that made even the most experienced officers gape in disbelief. As the coalition attempted to adapt, Corrin anticipated every maneuver. He shifted reserves, predicted attack vectors, and exploited patterns of movement that even Xyrillian strategists had overlooked. His sword, now more than a mere weapon, symbolized his understanding of human improvisation, adaptable, versatile, and decisive in execution. Soldiers followed his guidance without question, moved by the clarity of his commands rather than rank or title. For Lysera, the contrast between Corrin and her politically arranged groom, Lord Vaynor, could not have been starker. Vaynor adhered to procedure, relying on hierarchy and tradition, while Corrin thrived in unpredictability, turning chaos into victory. In the midst of the conflict, Lysera found herself drawn into Corrin's orbit in ways she did not fully understand. She walked alongside him on planetary surfaces scarred by battle, observing how he calmed panicked soldiers, stabilized damaged energy conduits, and improvised solutions to problems that had confounded the Empire for centuries. She saw how he moved, not with arrogance, but with purpose, not with showmanship, but with unwavering competence. Each time he acted, he reaffirmed the fundamental truth that had begun to take root in her mind. Humans were not fragile, they were resilient. They were capable of ingenuity, courage, and action that transcended expectation. The coalition attempted a daring strike on the palace itself, using stealth ships to infiltrate orbital defenses. Corrin anticipated their approach, positioning countermeasures with a subtlety that made the enemy fleet hesitate. He deployed decoys, manipulated energy readings, and rerouted communications to create confusion without exposing unnecessary forces to danger. When the enemy finally engaged, they found themselves trapped in a web of strategy. Each move anticipated, each action countered. The battle was over before it had truly begun, with minimal losses to the Xyrillians and maximum disruption to the attackers. Lysera's heart pounded as she realized that her empire's survival was now inseparably tied to this human's presence. During the lull that followed, Corrin moved through the palace, checking on both civilians and soldiers. Lysera followed him, noting the quiet authority with which he interacted with all he encountered. He spoke simply, observing, instructing, and correcting errors without condescension. Civilians, engineers, and soldiers all deferred to him instinctively, responding to competence and clarity rather than to lineage or rank. Lysera could not ignore the truth. This human, who had once been the subject of her mockery, had become essential to the Empire's stability. She felt a strange, complicated pride in his abilities, mingled with guilt for having underestimated him. Over the following weeks, Corrin continued to guide the Empire's defenses, while Lysera worked alongside him to coordinate intelligence, supply chains, and diplomatic overtures. She began to see the limitations of the Empire's reliance on hierarchy and tradition, and she understood that the human before her offered a perspective that could transform not only military strategy, but governance itself. Leaders began to listen, allies began to trust, and the scattered forces of the Empire began to operate with a cohesion that had seemed impossible before his arrival. Corran's presence had shifted the paradigm. Where once humans were considered fragile, now they were seen as essential, capable of shaping outcomes in ways the Xyrillians had never imagined. Corran's interventions did not stop at defense. He began proposing measures to strengthen the Empire's resilience, drawing on human ingenuity, adaptability, and improvisation. Energy grids were redesigned to allow redundancy. Planetary defenses were made modular and responsive, and communication networks were optimized for both speed and flexibility. Lysera observed the transformations with growing admiration, noting how Corran's human perspective challenged assumptions, identified vulnerabilities, and created opportunities for proactive solutions. She began to realize that the Empire's survival and perhaps its future dominance was no longer dependent solely on lineage, wealth, or technology, but on the presence of this extraordinary human who had proven time and again that adaptability and courage were worth more than centuries of protocol. Tensions continued to rise as the coalition regrouped. For a larger offensive, Corran devised a plan that balanced strategy, deception, and improvisation, coordinating the Empire's forces across multiple star systems. Lysera accompanied him in reviewing troop placements, energy field calibrations, and fleet maneuvers, increasingly aware that every decision he made reflected a synthesis of intellect, intuition, and human adaptability. Unlike Xyrillian commanders, who relied on calculation and precedent, Corran anticipated human and alien behavior alike, exploiting weaknesses and turning unpredictability into a strategic advantage. The decisive battle came when the coalition launched simultaneous attacks on 3 frontier worlds. Corran's strategy unfolded like clockwork. Mobile strike teams countered initial assaults, energy fields were rerouted to block concentrated attacks, and civilians were evacuated efficiently, all under his calm direction. Lysera watched in awe as he adapted in real time, shifting resources, predicting enemy maneuvers, and exploiting patterns no one else could see. His presence had become the keystone of the Empire's defense, and every soldier, engineer, and civilian acted with a cohesion that reflected his influence. The humans' unpredictable ingenuity had become the Empire's greatest asset by the battle's end. The coalition forces were routed, their fleets scattered, and their command fractured. Lysera walked among the survivors, observing the aftermath, and felt an unshakable truth. Humanity had not only saved the Empire, but it had redefined what the Xyrillians understood about strength, leadership, and strategy. Corran moved quietly among the ranks, ensuring that injured soldiers were tended to, damaged equipment repaired, and remaining threats neutralized. Lysera felt a growing admiration and respect, mixed with an awareness that the human before her had permanently altered the balance of power, and perhaps her own understanding of the universe. That evening, in the quiet halls of the palace, Lysera approached Corran. The sounds of the aftermath, the distant hum of repairs, the whispers of soldiers recounting the battle created a solemn backdrop for their encounter. "You've done what no one else could," she said softly, her voice reflecting both awe and unspoken recognition of the bond that had formed. Corran looked at her, expression calm and unwavering. "I did what had to be done," he replied simply, yet the weight of his actions spoke louder than any words. Lysera realized that this human, whom she had once mocked, had become indispensable to her empire, her people, and perhaps even to her understanding of herself. As the suns set over the horizon, casting long shadows through the palace, Lysera understood a profound truth. The human she had once considered fragile had proven that courage, adaptability, and ingenuity were far more powerful than lineage, wealth, or tradition. Corran had saved the empire, reshaped its strategies, and inspired a new understanding of what it meant to be strong. And she, Princess Lysera, had witnessed firsthand how one mortal could rise above expectation, defy prejudice, and change the course of history. In the quiet aftermath, she realized that the empire's survival and her own sense of purpose now rested not on her arranged betrothal, but on the remarkable human who had proven himself essential to everything she held dear. The empire held its breath. Word of the coalition's regrouping had reached the palace, carried by scouts, intelligence drones, and whispered reports from frontier systems. Their combined fleets were said to be vast, their tactics ruthless, and their resolve unshakable. The council quivered, debating for hours over strategy, probability, and precedent, while Lysera's gaze remained fixed on Corin. The human, who had once stumbled clumsily through ceremonial halls, now stood at the center of their deliberations, calm, focused, and unflinching. He did not raise his voice, nor did he assert his authority. He simply analyzed, observed, and directed. His presence had become the axis upon which the Empire's survival now depended. Lysera followed him closely as he moved through the palace, coordinating the distribution of resources, verifying the readiness of fleets, and instructing engineers on defensive measures. Everywhere he went, soldiers and civilians alike deferred to his judgment, inspired not by title but by competence. She marveled at the ease with which he commanded attention, the fluidity of his thought, and the unwavering certainty of his decisions. In every action, he demonstrated a quality the Empire had overlooked for centuries: the ability of one human to adapt, improvise, and overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. Lysera felt a pang of both pride and humility. She had mocked him, underestimated him, and yet he had proven more capable than any Xyrillian general or politician she had ever known. The first engagement began in the outskirts of the frontier systems. Corin's strategy was unconventional, leveraging the strengths of the human mind: adaptability, creativity, and rapid decision-making against the rigid structures of the coalition fleets. Lysera watched as he directed mobile strike units, staggered energy barriers, and coordinated planetary defenses with precise timing. Where the coalition expected predictable formations, they found fluidity, unpredictability, and deadly efficiency. Each maneuver was designed not merely to repel, but to exploit weaknesses, to create opportunities where none had been thought possible, and to force the enemy into reactive, chaotic motions. As the battle escalated, the coalition deployed specialized shock units designed to breach the front lines. Corin anticipated their movements, positioning countermeasures and orchestrating traps with a deftness that left even seasoned Xyrillian commanders in awe. Lysera followed him onto the command terraces, observing as he moved through holographic projections and tactical maps, calculating outcomes with clarity that seemed almost preternatural. Soldiers responded instantly to his commands, functioning as extensions of his strategic will. Civilians and engineers, inspired by his calm authority, performed tasks critical to maintaining energy grids, weapons systems, and supply lines. In every detail, the humans' ingenuity and courage reshaped the battlefield. The coalition's flagship appeared, a massive vessel bristling with energy weapons and armed drones, threatening to overwhelm the Xyrillian fleet. Corin's response was both simple and brilliant. He divided his forces, using decoy ships to draw fire, rerouted energy shields across multiple planets to create overlapping zones of protection, and led a small, elite strike team to infiltrate the flagship directly. Lysera's breath caught as she watched him prepare to board the enemy vessel. Understanding the risk, yet marveling at his calm confidence, he did not hesitate, for hesitation was a human frailty he had long mastered, turning uncertainty into decisive action. The infiltration was swift, precise, and devastatingly effective. Corin moved through the corridors of the flagship, neutralizing security systems, disabling drones, and engaging enemy personnel with a skill that combined agility, intuition, and the ruthless efficiency of one who understood both technology and strategy. Lysera, observing remotely through palace-linked sensors, could scarcely believe that one human was capable of executing such a complex operation with minimal resources. Yet, he advanced steadily, dismantling the flagship's command systems and forcing the enemy crew into chaos. Where the coalition had relied on overwhelming numbers, he relied on observation, adaptability, and the unyielding determination of a species long underestimated. As the flagship faltered, the Xyrillian fleet pressed the advantage, striking with coordinated precision guided by Corin's strategy. The coalition, now forced into disarray, struggled to maintain formation. Lysera saw entire squadrons retreat, their commanders incapacitated or neutralized, and their plans unraveling under the influence of a single human's foresight. Her admiration grew, mingled with an unspoken realization. This human, once mocked and dismissed, had become the linchpin of the Empire's defense. Without him, the coalition might have succeeded. With him, the impossible had become inevitable. Corin emerged from the flagship's command deck, calm and unscathed, having neutralized its leadership and disrupted its weapon systems. The vessel, once a symbol of overwhelming power, now drifted aimlessly, its threat nullified. Lysera approached him in the aftermath, her mind racing with both relief and awe. "You've saved not just the frontier worlds, but the Empire itself," she said quietly, her voice betraying a mixture of respect, gratitude, and something deeper she could not yet name. Corrin nodded, expression calm, yet every detail of his posture conveyed the weight of responsibility he bore without complaint. "I did what needed to be done," he replied simply, but the impact of his words resonated far beyond their simplicity. The Coalition's remaining forces retreated, scattered and demoralized, their confidence shattered. Across the frontier systems, civilians and soldiers alike celebrated the human who had turned the tide of war, the mortal whose ingenuity, courage, and adaptability had saved countless lives. Lysera walked among the survivors, witnessing the relief, the awe, and the renewed loyalty that Corrin inspired. The Empire, once teetering on the brink of chaos, now stood firm, its defenses reinforced, its people inspired, and its enemies humbled. She realized that humanity, long dismissed as weak, had proven itself essential, capable of shaping the fate of entire civilizations with intellect, courage, and determination. In the quiet that followed the battle, Lysera and Corrin walked through the palace gardens, their conversation a mixture of reflection, strategy, and tentative trust. She observed how he considered long-term consequences, not just immediate victory, and how he integrated human ingenuity with the Empire's resources to create sustainable systems of defense and governance. Her understanding of strength had shifted. It was no longer merely about lineage, rank, or technology, but about vision, adaptability, and the courage to act decisively when the moment demanded. Corrin embodied these qualities fully, and she could not deny the profound effect he had on her perception of leadership, duty, and even herself. The Empire's council, once rigid and conservative, began to recognize the value of his perspective. Reports flowed in from frontier governors praising his methods, and emissaries from allied systems requested his guidance in both defense and diplomacy. Lysera realized that Corrin's influence extended far beyond the battlefield. He was shaping the political, logistical, and strategic future of the Empire in ways the most seasoned Xyrillian minds had never envisioned. The human she had once mocked had become a force that no one could ignore, a living testament to the underestimated potential of humanity. Even her politically arranged Groom, acknowledged the truth. Where he had relied on tradition, hierarchy, and procedure, Corrin relied on insight, improvisation, and decisive action. The contrast was undeniable, and the court began to take note. Lysera's admiration, once tempered by protocol and expectation, now transformed into recognition that the human before her was not merely competent, he was extraordinary, the embodiment of qualities that her empire desperately needed, yet had long dismissed in mortals. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the palace, Lysera stood beside Corrin, gazing at the horizon where fleets had returned to their respective systems, and the Empire's territory remained secure. She felt an unshakable certainty that humanity, far from fragile, possessed the ingenuity, courage, and adaptability to confront even the most formidable threats. Corrin had proven it not once, but repeatedly, and in doing so, he had saved her people, her empire, and reshaped her understanding of strength and leadership. She realized that her political obligations, her arranged marriage, and the traditions she had been taught could no longer dictate her perception of what mattered most. In the quiet of the palace halls, Lysera approached Corrin one final time. The hum of machinery and distant celebrations provided a backdrop to a moment charged with unspoken truths. "You've changed everything," she said softly, her voice reflecting both admiration and gratitude. Corrin's calm eyes met hers, and he offered a simple nod. "I've done what had to be done," he replied, yet in his presence, the words carried the weight of all he had accomplished. Lysera understood fully. This human, once underestimated, had proven that courage, ingenuity, and the refusal to yield could reshape the fate of empires. The empire had survived, its enemies had been repelled, its people inspired, and the human who had once been the subject of mockery had emerged as a symbol of possibility, resilience, and strength. Lysera, standing beside him, recognized that the galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. One mortal, through intelligence, courage, and unshakable resolve, had saved everything, and in doing so, had proven that humanity, far from fragile, could stand as equals among the stars. As the night deepened, the palace quieted. Lysera and Corin walked among the gardens, reflecting on the trials they had faced and the victories they had achieved. She understood now that duty, protocol, and tradition were not the only measures of strength. Adaptability, courage, and ingenuity were equally vital. Humanity, embodied in Corin, had demonstrated this truth through action. The Empire would endure, stronger and wiser, because one human had dared to rise above expectation, save the day, and change the course of history. And so, the princess who had once chosen protocol over instinct, who had mocked humanity's supposed fragility, stood beside the human who had proven that even the smallest, most underestimated beings could alter destinies, protect empires, and command respect across the stars. Corin had saved everything, and in doing so, he had ensured that humanity would never again be underestimated. The galaxy had witnessed the power of courage, intelligence, and adaptability distilled into one mortal. And the Empire, its people, and the princess herself would carry the legacy of that truth forever.